Now, this self may be totally other than our inner self, especially if we have any form of social anxiety. Social anxiety is based 100% on the fear of being judged by other people, the fear of being shamed, the fear of being humiliated. And so that self will adapt itself in the environment to try to find out what the rules are, to try to find out what the values are, so that that self can engage in relationships and manage that social anxiety or that fear of being judged. Hi, I'm Aaron Tomlinson. Welcome back to the channel. And in this video, I want to talk about psychology. Is it a science? And if it is, what is its place in spirituality? And how do we blend psychology with spirituality to live a more fulfilling life? So we have to answer the question, what is psychology? And is psychology a science? There's been interesting developments over the last century or so in the study of psychology, and recently the direction that the field is going is more towards behavioralism, which I'll get into in a minute. But behavioralism is definitely rooted in the philosophical ideology of scientific materialism. I've done plenty of videos on scientific materialism and the hard problem of consciousness, so you can find those in the channel. But to give you a short explanation of what scientific materialism is, scientific materialism says that the only thing that exists is matter, material, atoms, energy, waves, that we're all just a byproduct of an arrangement of matter, including our mind, including our consciousness, including our experiences. So for the scientific materialist, they would say that consciousness, that what we experience internally and subjectively, is simply the result of the arrangement of the atoms and cells in our brains, that the brain produces every experience, every internal response that we have. And so therefore, consciousness is just the byproduct of this closed universe of materialism. Now, psychology started out more as a philosophy and part of the humanities. The word psychology itself means the study of the soul. The Greek word for soul is psyche or psyche, and ology, obviously, is the study of something. So psychology originally was the study of the soul, or the study of the contents of the mind. So if you think back to the early fathers of modern psychology, Freud, Adler, Jung, people like this, they were interested in the contents of the mind, the contents of the personality. And so thus psychoanalysis was developed by talking to people and having them self-report what the contents of their mind was and how it was operating and what it was doing. The problem with this, and this is why psychology, especially depth psychology, cannot be considered a science, is because it relies 100% on self-reporting. And self-reporting isn't necessarily good psychology, because we all know that people lie, or people distort, or people falsely report things. And it's not always nefarious. In other words, understanding our own consciousness, and Freud and Jung and these early developers of psychoanalysis understood these things. They talked about defense mechanisms. So in other words, I may not be able to be totally honest with what's going on inside of me because I have defense mechanisms that prevent me from feeling things like shame or internal pain or being judged by other people for what's going on inside. The other problem is that I can reframe. I mean, the mind does some crazy things, right? Like you can reframe, you can misremember. There's even good research to indicate that there is a phenomenon called false memory syndrome, where we remember something that actually didn't happen, but it's part of our memory anyway. So by its very nature, it could not be considered a science, because science relies on three things. It relies on observation, it relies on measurement, and it relies on repeatability before you can have a good theory or something that's considered evidence-based. Thus enter the school of psychology known as behavioralism or classical conditioning. So what the behaviorists would say, people like B.F. Skinner and others, John Watson, what they would say is that the only thing that can actually be scientifically studied is that which can be observed. And what can be observed is the person's behavior, not just their actions, but their actions, their words, their emoting, and things of this nature. And so psychological study then shifted to more of a scientific method that was concerned strictly with, like I said, behaviors, that which can be observed, that which can be measured, that which can be repeatable. And they said this validates then psychology as a science, and these are the only things that we can collectively be sure or certain of. And that trend has continued until today, even in therapy. If you see a counselor, or if you go to therapy, chances are pretty good that they are using methods of treating whatever's going on with you that have behavior in the title of the therapy that they're using. For example, cognitive behavioral therapy or dialectical behavioral therapy are all the rage because they can be based on behaviorism, and therefore they can have evidence-based research because it can be observed, it can be measured, it can be repeated, it can be compared with other people and so forth. And so all of the various disorders that are out there that we diagnose people with are based on a behaviorist model. And I think, unfortunately, the depth psychology it's not even taught in universities today. It's not even taught in doctor programs, and most psychologists that are licensed psychologists are not trained or in any of that at all. The exception to that might be if someone has a degree in transpersonal psychology, but those degree programs are very rare. So let's come back to the contents of our mind, the contents of the inner person, because the question really becomes, is there a person inside? Is there a soul inside? Is there something inside of us? Or are we just, frankly, wet machines? Are we just machines that have been conditioned by our environment to think a certain way and to act a certain way? And this I hear talked about by other teachers that I respect, where when the issue of free will comes up, do we really have free will? And if they answer no, then what they're saying is there is no agent inside of us that can actually act of our own volition or of our own intention, that all of our decisions are simply the byproduct of our environment and of our conditioning. So what's interesting is that we really do have separate selves. We really do. We have a self, certainly, that is conditioned by our environment. There are aspects of our behavior, there are aspects of our personality that are absolutely the byproduct of nurture, absolutely the byproduct of our conditioning and of our programming. But I personally believe that we have another self inside, or several selves inside, that exist exclusively within our own microcosm. I'll come back to that term, microcosm, in a minute. And here's what I mean. No one can really know the contents of your mind. Nobody can really know exactly what your experiences are. We all rely on self-reporting. There is a self, in other words, that exists completely isolated from the rest of the world. It can be acted upon by the world or influenced by the world. And if you believe in free will, then it can also act upon and influence the world around us, which we would call the macrocosm. So we have an external self, or what some psychologists call a social self. It's the self that we present when we are in relationships. It's the self that we present when we are with others. Now, this self may be totally other than our inner self, especially if we have any form of social anxiety. Social anxiety is based 100% on the fear of being judged by other people, the fear of being shamed, the fear of being humiliated. And so that self will adapt itself in the environment to try to find out what the rules are, to try to find out what the values are, so that that self can engage in relationships and manage that social anxiety or that fear of being judged. And I think we all have certain degrees of social anxiety, and we certainly all have a social self, and we certainly all have a conditioned self. So that's the aspect of psychology that could be considered science because that's the only one that fits within the scientific model of observation and repeatability and measurement and all of those things. It can be looked at, it can be analyzed, it can be studied. But if we come back to the early psychology and we come back to the contents of the mind, again, I want to stress that the only way that can be analyzed is it's completely dependent upon self-reporting. So let's look at spirituality, because in the ancient Greek philosophies, spirituality was part and parcel. It just went with it. It was assumed that spirituality was part of our experience. And I would guess if you're watching this channel, if you subscribe to this channel, or if you follow this, that you have interest in spirituality. And spirituality, by its very nature, is also something that deals primarily with content and processes. So here's what I mean. For example, how do you know that when I say green, I mean the same thing that you mean when you say green? I mean, how do you know that I see green in my mind the same way that you see green? Perhaps what you see as green is actually blue, and what I see as blue is actually green, but we were conditioned to call whatever that internal experience of color is, we were conditioned to call that blue or green. How do we know if I say I'm in love, that I'm experiencing the same emotions that you experience when you say you're in love, or that your partner experiences when they say that they are in love? And this gets us to the hard problem of consciousness. Now, I mentioned a couple of terms earlier in the video, the microcosm and the macrocosm. And this comes out of Greek philosophy and is something that's still talked about in a lot of spiritual practices today. For example, in Hermetic philosophy or in Jewish Kabbalah, there is reference to the microcosm and the macrocosm. The macrocosm would be the large world. It would be the world out there that science is exploring by observing, measuring, and looking for things that are repeatable or reproducible. The microcosm is the person's own subjective experience. And the microcosm is the playground of spirituality. It's the world in which most spirituality exists. In other words, if I have an experience in meditation or in a dream or in astral projection, or I have a visitation, whether I think it's from God or from Jesus or from an angel or from a god or a goddess, those things are happening internally. Those things are happening in the microcosm. Those things are happening subjectively. So the word cosmos is a Greek word that means an orderly arrangement or a world. So when we're talking about the microcosm, we're talking about a world inside of us that is completely self-contained. It's describing the problem of psychology when it comes to studying the content or to knowing what subjective experience is like, because it cannot be observed by another person. So that's why I say there is a person inside of us who lives inside of this microcosm, or who lives inside of this cosmos. And again, let's be honest, whether you have spirit guides, whether you have spiritual experiences that transform your inner self, even if you have a spiritual experience where the effects of that experience can be measured externally, for example, you have precognition and then the event happens, you have some form of telepathic communication or intuition, psychic abilities, all of those things are happening inside. Think about if you ever went and saw a psychic medium to get in touch with departed loved ones. The person who's the medium is experiencing contact with ancestors or with departed loved ones, your departed loved ones in this case, but they're experiencing that entirely within their microcosm, and then they're self-reporting what they're hearing, and then you can decide for yourself whether they have legitimately contacted someone departed from you that you loved or that loved you, or whether or not it's all baloney or they're a charlatan. And usually the measure for that would be how accurate is the information that this person is reporting. But again, that's all happening within the microcosm. Now, while that can be very complicated in terms of a religion, in terms of a community forming itself around the spiritual experiences and spiritual teachings of another person, because again, we're relying upon that self-reporting. We're relying upon the experiences that they're having within their own microcosm. And then usually we're following that path. That's the external person being influenced by the environment. So if I go to a guru and a guru tells me that I need to drink my own piss, which is a thing out there, that it will somehow activate Kundalini or enhance my spiritual experiences, I'm relying upon their self-reporting, and I may choose whether or not I want to participate in that. But again, it's that external self that lives in the macrocosm that's being influenced by this teaching. And then I have to decide whether or not I want to incorporate that and make that part of my microcosm. And so that's why I affirm that spirituality is a very personal journey. It is a very personal, individual path. And also why I don't think that we can be dogmatic about our spiritual philosophies or try to push our spiritual experience or techniques on other people. We can share what we've experienced as part of the microcosm of our own spirituality with others, and then they can decide if they want to incorporate that or if that benefits them in some way in their own spiritual journey. But I don't think that we should become dogmatic and say this is how it is, as though we're making ontological statements. The word ontology means the nature of things. So because I have subjective spiritual experiences does not mean that I have accurate information about the ontological nature of reality. I may or I may not. So that's the problem with it. But the freedom in it is this, is that when we realize that these experiences are all part of our microcosm, and we honor the microcosm as its own orderly arrangement in which we live and in which we cannot escape, then we have the freedom to test these things out for ourselves. It's not that much different, I suppose, than what the scientist does with the macrocosm. They're looking at the orderly arrangement, they're looking for patterns, they're looking for repeatability in order to establish good theories about the nature of the macrocosm. We're the only ones who can test and explore what's going on within our own microcosm, our own internal orderly arrangement, and we're the ones that have to dwell and live inside of that house. And so if you have a spiritual experience, if you have a spirit guide, if you have an encounter with Jesus or with angels or with any kind of non-physical or interdimensional entities, then you have to feel into that. You have to test, is this enriching me? Is this enhancing me? Is this helping me? Is this supporting me? Is this something that I want to further explore inside this microcosm? Is this something that I want to further test inside of my own microcosm, or is this something that I want to leave alone or put it on a shelf and come back to it later or kick out entirely? So you have complete sovereignty, if you will, over your own internal experiences in terms of your own choices, again, about what you're going to explore, what you're going to have. So you don't have to prove it or validate it to other people, is what I'm saying. One of the things that causes us to doubt our intuition or makes us hesitant about exploring a spiritual path or getting in touch with angels or spirit guides is because we're afraid we're just making it up. It's just our imagination. They're just our imaginary friends. Well, that's all part of the microcosm. You can't get around that or away from that. And so that gives you the freedom to follow your intuition, because your intuition is coming out of the microcosm and it does not need to be validated by other people in order for you to benefit from it. I hope you liked this video. If you liked it, please subscribe to the channel. Please like and share. And also, if you're interested in joining our New Day Global community, we have a Facebook group on Facebook, and that link is in my bio. Thank you for watching this all the way to the end. I hope that you are doing well and that you're blessed. Please comment in the comments so that I can know what to do with future videos. Again, this is Aaron Tomlinson, and thank you for watching this.